本日は国際オンラインセミナーデジタル社会を形成するデータ基盤と人材にご参加いただき誠にありがとうございます。司会進行を務めさせていただきます。日本 IT 団体連盟 IT 教育人材育成委員会の事務局田中恵子と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。まずは皆様に同時通訳のご案内と注意事項について申し上げます。本セミナーは全プログラム同時通訳がございます。画面右下の通訳ボタンをクリックしていただき、ご希望の音声チャンネルを選択いただくことができます。また本セミナーは Zoom を使いましたウェブセミナー形式での実施となります。ご参加の皆様の音声、カメラ機能はミュート設定となっております。Q&A 機能またはチャットを使い、講演者への質問、コメント等が可能となっております。質問以外のコメント、利用上のサポートについてはチャットからお寄せください。続いて注意事項です。回線機器の状況によっては通信が不安定になったり、それを原因とした映像等の不具合が発生したりする場合がございます。あらかじめご了承ください。また、プログラムの記載にしている講演時間が多少前後する場合がございます。そちらについてもあらかじめご了承ください。ご質問は Q&A 機能から受付いたしますが、言語や時間の制約から回答については、後日 IT 連盟ホームページ掲載のレポートにて取りまとめさせていただきます。また、ご退場時はアンケートにご協力をお願いいたします。開会に先立ち、日本 IT 団体連盟代表理事筆頭副会長長谷川航より、ビデオにてご挨拶を申し上げます。それではご覧ください。
日本 IT 団体連盟代表理事筆頭副会長の長谷川航でございます。本日はお忙しいところ、私どもの主催いたします国際セミナーデジタル社会を形成するデータ基盤と人材にご参加いただき誠にありがとうございます。またご多用中にもかかわらず国内外からご登壇いただきます講演者の皆様にも心より感謝申し上げます。さて、2016年7月に発足した一般社団法人日本 IT 団体連盟、略して IT 連盟は、日本の IT 関連企業約5000社、総従業員数約400万人で構成される60以上の業界団体が結集した日本最大級の IT 関連団体の連合体でございます。IT 連盟は設立当初より我が国の IT 分野を統括する省庁の設置を強く要望してまいりましたが、昨年2021年にデジタル庁の設置が実現いたしました。デジタル庁のリーダーシップのもと、今後ますますの経済発展と国民生活の向上を期待するところであります。私は1963年に創立した日本最初のコンピューター教育機関である京都コンピューター学院と、2004年に開学した日本最初の IT 専門職大学院である京都情報大学院大学の統括理事長として IT 教育に携わってまいりました。本日は京都コンピューター学院の京都駅前校からこのメッセージをお送りしております。こちらの校舎では本学創立以来、教育、実習、研究で使用してきた過去のコンピューターなどを保存しております。情報処理学会より情報処理技術遺産として認定されたトスバック3400など、7機種をはじめ、 歴史的に貴重なコンピュータの展示を行っており、2009年には同学会より分散コンピュータ博物館の第1号として認定をいただいております。私は IT 教育に携わる一人として、日本が世界最高水準の IT 社会を構築するためには、IT 人材の育成がとりわけ重要であると考えております。そのためには、教育機関はもちろんのこと、社会全体で取り組む必要があると考えております。IT 連盟においては、創設当初より産学官一体となった IT 教育の推進と人材育成を活動の一つとして掲げております。本日はヨーロッパ、アメリカからもご登壇いただき、全部で4つのセッションでそれぞれご講演いただく予定となっております。今回の国際セミナーが皆様にとりまして有意義な時間となりますことを心より願っております。それでは国際セミナーデジタル社会を形成するデータ基盤と人材を最後までごゆっくりお楽しみください。
それでは本セミナーのテーマと課題意識について簡単に振り返りさせていただきます。日本における IT 人材不足は30年以上前から指摘されてきました。2019年に経産省が発表した試算では、2030年には約79万人が不足されているとされており、最新の DX 白書でも日米との対比で、日本は IT 人材が質、量ともに不足していることが示されています。デジタルトランスフォーメーションが進み、あらゆる産業では IT が必須となりました。IT 需要が拡大する一方、国内の人材供給力は低下しており、IT 人材不足は今後より一層深刻化することが明らかです。こうした中、どのように産学が連携し、最新のテクノロジーを踏まえ人材育成を行っていくか、本日は国内外からゲストにご登壇いただきます。本日はこのようなプログラムで進めてまいります。どうぞ最後までお付き合いください。それでは早速第一セッションの講演に移ります。まずは IT 人材を育成する教育に目を向けていきましょう。世界的なコンピューターサイエンス分野のカリキュラム標準を策定しております。Association for Computer Machinery と IEEE は2021年に情報系分野の新たなグローバルカリキュラム標準 CC2020 を公開しています。本日はこの CC2020 の策定にあたった iCD 協会の林口英二様に産業界ニーズと大学教育とのギャップという課題認識についてお話しいただきます。それでは林口様、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
はい、画面共有できているかと思いますが、ただいまご紹介に預かりました、林口英二です。今日は最初のセッションということで、ただいま田中先生のご紹介のありました CC2020 と、をベースにコンピテンシに基づいた産学連携の展望について、お話をさせていただきます。最初にお断りなんですけれども、ちょっと資料がですね、今年3月に IEEE の EDU92022 っていうところでプレゼンをしました、ものを活用しております関係でですね、多少英文のページが混ざっております。ちょっとそこの辺だけご容赦お願いしたいなというふうに思います。本日のプレゼンテーションは、1章から5章になりまして、私がちょっと自己紹介を最初にさせていただきますけれども、1、2、3というふうに進めさせていただいて、4番目の本題のですね、ペーパーイントロダクションということで、この今日のプレゼンテーションのベースになってます IEEE の EDU9-2022 への投稿論文の内容をベースにですね、お話をさせていただきます。で最後、お勝利でですね、締めくくりをさせていただくという形になります。さて、最初に私の簡単な自己紹介なんですけれども、私はですね、ここで、上段と下段の箱がありますが、上段が以前のですね、自分の活動になります。日本 IBM がで長くですね、仕事をしておりました。その後、独立行政法人の情報処理推進機構 IPA で、IT 人材育成本部というところでですね、ICD の開発をやり、今日ちょっと少し触れるかもしれませんけど、それから本日のメインの CC2020 の開発のメンバーに、参加を始めたという経緯がございます。でその後、現在、今、下の方にありますけれども、VJP という仕事で、株式会社というところで仕事をしたり、ICD 協会で理事をしたり、大学で研究員をしたりということになっております。さて、今日の話のですね、全体を少し最初にご紹介だけしておきます。今日の話はですね、先ほど言いましたように、IEEE の EDU9-2022 への投稿論文の話をベースになるわけですけども、それはちょっと上段にありますに青字で紹介していますように、The Competency-Based Computing Curriculum というですね、ペーパーのタイトルがありますが、それに基づきます。それで、ここで何をやったかということなんですけれども、一言で言えば、大学のカリキュラムと産業界のスキルの要求を比較したということをやったということになります。場合によってはですね、それってわざわざ今やるわけっていうふうに聞こえるかもしれませんですけども、実はですね、この比較というのは CC2020 というものが登場して初めて可能となりました。それまでできなかったのかということでありますけれども、おいおい説明をさせていただきますが、それまでは難しかったんです。それで CC2020 とですね、産業界のそのスフィアというものがですね、同じベースで記述をされたということになったおかげでですね、やっと比較の議論ができたということがございます。その点につきまして、少し説明をさせていただきます。まず先ほどから言っています、この CC2020 というのは何ぞやというところです。CC2020 の前にはですね、CC2005 というものがありました。これは2005とか2020というのが公開された年度を示しておりますので、2005から15年を経てようやく2020が登場したということになります。かつ、2020は実は2021年に公開されましたので、ちょっとタイトルが、1年ずれるんですけれども、そういう15年後に新しいものに刷新されたという事情がございます。かつですね、CC2005 というのは、大学のカリキュラムが、ノレッジベース、知識ベースで表現されておりました。つまり、例えばデータベースだとか、例えばネットワークだとか、例えば Java だとか、C だとか、そういう一粒一粒のですね、知識を大学で教えて学生は学ぶのよと。そういう形態で作成されていたという事実がございます。もう一つですね、そのノーレッジをですね、コンピューティングディシプリンといいまして、下の方にちょっと右下にですね、 6つの箱がありますけども、CE、コンピュータエンジニアリング、CS、コンピュータサイエンス、IS、インフォメーションシステム、IT、インフォメーションテクノロジー、SE、ソフトウェアエンジニアリング、あと、ちょっとそれを全部足し算した、絵になってますけども、そういう5つのですね、ディスプリンというふうに分けて、カリキュラムがノーレッジベースで定義されていたという事実がございます。で、実は日本情報処理学会がですね、これを和訳してまして、それは J07 というのがありますけども、それは未だに J7 ということで、非常に国内では、日本国内では著名でありますけれども、そういった事情がございました。で、一方、CC2020 はですね、これをコンピテンシーベースというものに書き換えました。コンピテンシーベースって何なのということなんですけども、後で実例を見ていただきますので、それでちょっと雰囲気をつかんでいただきたいと思いますが、CC2020 では、コンピテンシーをノーレッジプラススキルプラスディスポジションという形で定義をしております。ノーレッジ、これは知識ですね。CC2005 で言いますところの知識です。で、スキルというのはそれを駆使していろいろ活用してですね、いかにして使い回しをするかっていうところの意味合いです。ディスポジション、これはですね、ちょっと使い慣れない言葉で、一体何のことだという感じですけれども、人間力というか、人の性格というか、別の言葉で言えばソフトスキルといいますか、そういったものに、だというふうに認識していただければ結構かと思います。ちょっとそれだけでもまだ分かりにくいっちゃ分かりにくいんですけれども、実際の仕事の表現だったり、経験の表現だったり、そういったものに、なります。で、もう一つはですね、このコンピューティングディスプリンという CC2005 では5つだった領域を拡張しました。CSEC、これはセキュリティのエリアですけども、そこを拡張して、あとですね、後追いでデータサイエンス、DS を拡張しました。実はこの論文を作っているときは DS が出ていませんでしたので、この研究の中では DS は省いてございます。一方、スフィアですけど、この CC2020 と比較対象するスフィアというものはですね、産業界の IT スキルのグローバルデファクトスタンダードというふうに見ていただいて結構です。スフィアってスキルフレームワーク for the Information Age って長いんですけども、みんなスフィアと呼んでおります。200カ国以上で使用されて11カ国語に翻訳されております。日本語もこの中に入っておりますけども、日本語は私が翻訳をして公開しているというところになります。それで、ほとんどの使用はですね、無料で使えるんですけども、ビジネス活用だけは有料ということにはなっております。オーストラリア、ニュージーランド、サウジアラビアはスフィアを国家 IT スキル標準として採用をしております。これはどういう意味かと言いますと、こういった国に属する企業、組織はですね、たとえビジネス活用の有料の使い方をしても、無料で使えます。なぜかというと、国がですね、スフィアに対して、一定の料金を支払っているということがございますので、その国に属する企業はどういう使い方をしてもただ。しかも出来上がったスキル標準なので、なんていうんでしょうか、わざわざそのスキル標準をどうするべきかって悩む必要もないというのがありますけど、それで、スフィアはですね、2、3年ごとにずっと改定をしておりまして、今回の研究では2018年に、発表されていますスフィアバージョン7というのを使っております。その後、バージョン8に 8に、バージョンアップされましたけれども、これはこういう調査の研究の後になりましたので、8は使ってはいません。寿司屋の中身を簡単にご説明します。寿司屋はですね、スキルと呼ばれるものが102個定義されています。右側の絵にありますように、上から下に、こう102個のスキルが並んでおります。それぞれ6つのカテゴリーに分けて、赤い色だったり、ずっと上が赤く下の方に緑の、ものまでですね、こうシステムの、構築にあたるいわゆる上流と呼ばれるところから、別に下が下流というわけじゃないんですけども、下の方のですね、いろんな下流と言ってもいいかもしれませんけど、そういう領域に分けて102個が定義されているという形になっています。それでこれスキルと呼んでますからちょっと紛らわしいんですけれども、スキルという名前ながら、実はコンピテンシで定義をされています。その中身をですね。だからちょっとその辺ちょっと注意をして見ていただく必要がございます。もう一つあるのはですね、この表で示していますように、各スキル、102個の一個一個のスキルが7段階の責任レベル、7 Level of Responsibility、LOR、日本語で責任レベルと言っていますけども、そういう一個一個がそのレベルに定義されています。で、特定のスキルがですね、レベル1、つまり新人さんのレベルで、人の後ついてですね、そのスキルを何とか使いますというレベルから、レベル7、もう確固たる専門家としてですね、そのスキルを駆使するというか、人のお手本になるような使い方をするというレベルまで、定義をされております。ただですね、今回の比較におきましては、この責任レベル、LOR は対象としませんでした。なぜかというと、この102個のスキルの一体どれとカリキュラムが対応するんだということをまず確認したいというのがテーマとしてありましたので、そのレベルオブレスポンジビリティは一応ちょっと当研究からは置いて進めましたということです。もう一つありますのは、寿司屋には寿司屋ビューというものが提供されています。それは寿司屋のですね、例えばこれ、左側にデジタルトランスフォーメーションビューというのが出てますけど、寿司屋102個のスキルのうち、デジタルトランスフォーメーションに関しましては、その中に属する45個のスキルについて、きちんと獲得しておけば、デジタルトランスフォーメーションに対応できると、そういうことになっております。それがビッグデータだったり、デブオプスだったりということに定義をされている形になっています。後でデジタルトランスフォーメーションビューの45個のスキルについては、活用しますので、後で登場をするということになります。さて、実際のペーパーの中身の紹介に入ります。CC2020 とスフィアをですね、両方ともコンピテンシーで書かれていますので、そのコンピテンシーをですね、紐解くことによりまして、両者を一致している領域と一致していない領域に分けることができます。で、一致している領域はここではエリア A というから一致していない領域、スフィアにしかない領域はエリア B、CC2020 にしかないエリアはエリア C というふうに呼んでおります。それで、このイメージを持っていただいて、この当論文で、設定いたしていました3つのリサーチクエスチョンを、紹介します。 これは実は論文では一番最初にこれを紹介してるんですけども、この3つについて解きほぐしていくよという、そういう位置づけになります。リサーチクエスチョン1、CC2020 とスフィアはどのぐらいマッチしているか。つまり、先ほどの絵ではですね、エリア A の大きさはどのぐらいかということです。ほとんどマッチしているのか、あまりマッチしてないのかというところですね。で、2番目がリサーチクエスチョン2、アンマッチしない理由とその理由は何か。先ほどのあれで、絵で言いますと、エリア B とエリア B。ごめんなさい、エリア B とエリア C ですね。それは一体どういうものか。それはなぜマッチしないのか。それからマッチしない領域についてどういうふうに考えていいのかというのがリサーチクエスチョンの2番目です。で、最後のリサーチクエスチョン3はですね、CC2020 がデジタルトランスフォーメーションに対してどのぐらい対応しているかという、先ほどのスフィアのデジタルトランスフォーメーションビューをちょっとお話ししましたけども、それを使って、リサーチクエスチョン3に対応するということにしました。これはデジタルトランスフォーメーションは今もうあちこちらで非常にポピュラーなお話ですので、ちょっとその状況を確認したいということです。さて、リサーチクエスチョン A、エリア A ですね。エリア A がどういう状況であるかというのを1枚で説明した非常に細かな絵が出ております。これをこう目で追うということは不可能だということは承知をしておりますので、ちょっとイメージだけ紹介させていただきます。この上の段がですね、スフィアのバージョン7で、横にですね、102個のスキルがずっと広がっております。それで、目を凝らしていただくと、なるほどという感じなんですけども、ところどころスキルがですね、グレーに色付けされているところがございます。このグレーに色付けされたスキルはですね、CC2020 とはマッチしていない、スキルという意味合いです。そして白いところはマッチしているという感じになって、途中でマッチしてない領域があるなという感じだと思います。それから、この絵の下の方はですね、CC2020 側です。CC2020 側はですね、下から、1、2、下の茶色から上の緑まで7つの帯からなっております。で、上の緑の帯をちょっと置いておきまして、下の6つの帯ですね。これが各ディシプリンごとに、スフィアと付け合わせをした結果が実は出てるんです。で、ここの中に0とかですね、数字が入ってるんですけども、0のところはスフィアとはマッチしてないと。1以上のところはマッチしていると。こういう感じになっております。で、7番目のグリーンのベルトはですね、帯は、それを全部足し算したものということで、このマッチアンマッチを見るときは、グリーンの帯と上のスフィアを比較するということで、分かることになっていますけど、これだと当然分かりにくいので、ちょっと次に進めさせていただきます。すいません。スライドがですね、1枚欠けているようで申し訳ございません。ちょっと口で補足をさせていただきます。実はですね、102個のスフィアのスキルのうち CC2020 とマッチをしているのは66個です。パーセンテージで言うと 65%。それと、マッチしてないスキルの数が36個。パーセンテージで言うと35個になります。従いまして、エリア A の大きさは、スフィアで見た場合には、6割5分が CC2020 とマッチしているエリアという状況になっております。それでですね、そのエリア A に該当するっていうのはどういう 雰囲気かというのをちょっとご紹介します。左側に CC2020 の IS ディスプリンというもののですね、一部が参考に出ています。それから、右側がですね、スフィアバージョン7の ITSP というスキルが出ております。で、CC2020 に黒ポチが2つあります。で、これはですね、黒ポチがついているということは、それはスフィアとマッチしているよということになっています。それで、これをですね、IS の、これは一部なわけですけども、これを全部 CC2020 の全部に対して、この、黒丸がつくかどうかということを作業としてやったということになります。で、黒丸がついたものはスフィアとマッチしたわけですけれども、マッチした側の、スフィアは 65% だったということになります。それからこれはですね、マッチしない例なんですけども、スフィアの方にポートフォリオマネジメントという、どのプロジェクトに対してどのぐらいのお金を投資して、どのぐらいの結果が、リターンが期待できるかということで、いくら投資したらいいかっていうようなことを、考えるスキルなわけですけども、そういったものは CC2020 の方にはございません。大学でそういうことを教えるということはないというふうに思いますので、予想通りというか、ないということになっております。一方、CC2020 の CS ディシプリンという、CS コンピュータサイエンスですね。ここにおきましてはですね、これ例なんですけども、非常に基本的なですね、これデータによってどのアルゴリズムを選ぶのかと。で、そのアルゴリズムのコンプレックスティはオーダーとしてどんなもんだということを考えるというようなコンピテンシーが並んでおります。そのレベルのものがですね、さすがにスフィアの中にあるというわけではなくてですね、これは CC2020 だけにある、コンピテンシーということになっております。すみません。ここでちょっと先ほど言いました数字の、マッチのエリア A に対するマッチングの、数字での確認が出ておりますけども、先ほど言いましたように、この絵のですね、向かって、左側が、何個のスキルでマッチしたかということを示していますけども、赤枠で囲んだところですね、マッチしたところがブルー、66という数字が見えると思います。アンマッチなところが茶色で36というのが見えると思いますけども、そういったことになっております。右側はそれをパーセンテージで表したものということです。さて、今度はアンマッチをしていない領域に目を向けたいと思います。アンマッチをしていない領域、エリア P。これはCC2020 にはなく、スフィア側にだけある、36個のスキルなんですけれども、6つの領域に対して、いろいろマッチしないものがあるなということです。それで、マッチしない理由をですね、見てみますと、3種類に分かれるというふうに考えています。1番目はビジネスオリエンティッドなスキル。2番目が組織オーガナイゼーションに関係したようなスキル。3番目はですね、先進的なテクノロジーに関係したスキル。こういったものが、大学のカリキュラムではカバーできていないなというところを確認したという次第です。もう一つのエリアですね。エリア C。CC2020 にだけあって、スフィアにはないものはどういうものなのかということです。これも絵がですね、字が細かくって、カテゴリーのところはもう読めないと思います。申し訳ございません。それで、ちょっと雰囲気でまず確認をしていただきたいんですけども、 全部色塗りされているところはですね、マッチングを、スフィアとマッチングしているところです。それで、白抜きにカテゴリー以下がですね、カテゴリーから横に白になっているところは、マッチングしてない領域になります。で、下の方、つまり IT、SE、CSEC ってほとんどマッチしていますけども、上の方のコンピュータエンジニア、コンピュータサイエンスという領域はですね、結構アンマッチですということが、分かっているということになります。CE とか CS は本当に、数学とかアルゴリズムの基本的なところが多いもんですから、どうしてもこうなると。IT とか SE、ソフトウェアエンジニアリングだとか CSEC、セキュリティのところはですね、比較的、スフィアとのマッチングは、高いということになっております。ここでアンマッチの理由はですね、4つほどありまして、1番目が、まずファンダメンタルな内容であるということ。それから2番目がですね、スフィアのスキルじゃなくて、スフィアのレベルオブレスポンディビリティ、責任レベルのディフィニションに関係するところのカリキュラムが混ざっております。それから、ちょっと、内容不明確なものがあったり、それからリーズン4番目はですね、産業界のスキルじゃないというふうに見れるところですね。社会的な問題、これはセキュリティのところがそうなんですけども、学問とその社会はどういうふうにあるべきかみたいなですね、そういう、それがセキュリティ上どういう大事なんだという、ちょっとそもそも論になりますけども、そういった学問がありますが、それはスフィアとはマッチしないと。最後にリサーチクエスチョン3、デジタルトランスフォーメーションのビューがスフィアに定義されて、おりましたので、45項ですね。これが CC2020 とどういうマッチングのレベルかということです。これは45項のスキルで、グレーのところがマッチ、白いところがマッチということなんですけども、64% がマッチして、36% がアンマッチということです。これはスフィア全体とのマッチングの率とですね、同じだというふうに、見ていいと思います。つまり、CC2020 はですね、別に特別 DX、デジタルトランスフォーメーションに対して、カリキュラムが、適合しているということは見られないということに、と考えていいと思っております。最後に、3つのリサーチクエスチョンを整理してみて、その結果なわけですけれども、大半はもう今お話をしてきましたので、一部だけちょっと振り返りをしたいと思います。リサーチクエスチョン2、アンマッチしない理由ところについて、大学と産業界はどういうふうに考えるべきかということなんですね。この客観的にこれが初めて浮き彫りになったということもありますので、ちょっとその捉え方の整理なんですけども、エリア B、つまりスフィアにしかないところはですね、新しく来る方はもうそこは全く真っ白で来るわけなんで、研修かなんかで補わないといけないと。で、大学はですね、もしそこが必要であれば、カリキュラムを追加する、あるいはもうカリキュラム以外でですね、インターンシップというのもありますので、カリキュラムの外側でこれを補うというような考え方もあろうと思います。それからエリア C、CC2020 にしかないところ。これは基礎学問の領域が多いので、これは大学側もですね、これやめるっていうような話はないと思うんですね。それをきちんと継続をすると。それから、産学とですね、それでいいよねっていうアセスは、した方する必要があるかと思います。ただ、これはですね、大学ごとにちょっと対応が異なってくると思うんですね。研究者を育成したり、大学院に、行く人を育成する大学ですとですね、CE とか、CS の領域が多いので、特にそれはそれでいいんじゃないかというような捉え方で、いけると思いますし、片やですね、産業界に学生を送り込むというような大学ですと、本当に、より、 スフィアにマッチしたアレンジがいるということを検討するということが必要かと思います。ただ、産学連携でですね、今回同じコンピテンシーで資格できておりますので、実現、産学連携で実現するということは可能というふうに思います。最後に、今後の展望ということで、ちょっとコメントをさせていただきます。この研究ではスフィアのバージョン7でしたけど、先ほど言いましたようにバージョン8になって、スフィアの最新版はバージョン8ですので、それを見直すという必要があろうかというふうに思います。それからスフィアのですね、責任レベル LOR は検討から外しております。従いましてですね、これはどういうことかというと、単にマッチをしているということだけで、カリキュラムがスフィアのスキルを満足したレベルまで意味しているかというのは別問題です。それで、ちゃんとスフィアのレベルオブレスポンシビリティの一定のレベルまでカリキュラムがカバーしているなということは別に考察が必要だというふうに考えております。それから、大学院のカリキュラムがですね、例えば IS においては定義をされています。で、今回その CC2020 はバチェラー領域になりますけど、大学院まで展望したときにどうなるかというところは、調べる価値があるかなというふうに思っております。あと CC20 と今回はスフィアと対応しましたけど、さらに他のフレームワークがデジコンプ、ディスコ、いろいろありますので、特に私はICD を開発しておりますので、ICD の思い入れは非常に強いわけですけども、ICD との比較というのもですね、やってみたいなというふうに思っております。あとですね、今回対応を人力で右と左と見てですね、やったわけですけども、非常にこれは疲れる作業でございます。できればこれをですね、辞書を作ってマシンラーニングで機械的にこなせるというふうにできると、非常にいいなというふうに思っております。以上でですね、どうもここで終了ということで、誠にご清聴のほどありがとうございました。ということで、私のお話は失礼するという形にいたします。よろしくお願いします。
林口様、ありがとうございました。カリキュラムがコンピテンシーベーストになったということで、産業界のフレームワークと対比することができるということ、それから、客観的なギャップを認識することで、グローバルに産学が連携して、一緒に人材育成に取り組んでいけるのかなというお話を伺うことができました。最後にお話しされていた、そのスキル情報を機械にマシンリーダブルにマッチングするということについては、セッション4のジェイソンさんの講演の中で少しお話を予定しておりますので、そういった点にご関心の方は引き続きお楽しみいただければと思います。さて、こうした IT 人材のコンピテンスを示したものとして、日本には IPA が開発し、iCD 協会が普及を行っております、i-Competency Dictionary がございます。他方、ヨーロッパには e-Competence フレームワークという欧州共通の規格がございます。続いての第2セッションでは、ヨーロッパから2名のゲストをお迎えして、欧州の IT 専門職のコンピテンス枠組みである e-Competence フレームワーク、略して e-CF について最新の展開をお話しいただきます。英語での講演となりますので、日本語で視聴される方は、Zoom 右下の通訳ボタンから日本語チャンネルを指定してお聞きください。ご登壇いただくのは、ヨーロッパの IT 専門職業人の団体であります、IT プロフェッショナリズムユーロップにて、e-CF カリキュラムガイドラインプロジェクトをリードしているロコ・デフィーナ様、それから、欧州標準化委員会 ICT プロフェッショナリズムとデジタルコンピテンスに関する技術委員会 TC428 の議長で、 アイルランドコンピューター協会の事務局長でもいらっしゃいます、メアリー・クレアリーさんです。それではよろしくお願いいたします。
Good morning. Good morning. I'm hoping that you can see my correct title slide at this point. So it's a great pleasure to be given the opportunity to speak to you all today. This is a two-part presentation, as was indicated to you, given by me, Mary Cleary, from the Irish Computer Society and the Technical Committee of SEN, on professionalism and digital competences, and Rocco Defina. And Rocco will give you an introduction to himself in a couple of minutes. We've been working together on IT professionalism, the European e-competence framework, and digital skills in Europe at a high level in general for many years. So you might wonder why Europe is so interested in investing in IT professionalism and digital skills and professional level senior people working in the IT industry. And of course, it's obvious that it's important for society. And for IT in particular, because it is not a regulated profession like some other professions, it's very important that we're able to establish standards of competence and best practice for people who are working within it. There is a very significant skills gap in Europe, as there is worldwide. In 2020, we were 750,000 IT professionals short of our requirements. And at a high level for digital leaders, 250,000 of those more were needed to meet the needs that we have. Europe also has to be very cognizant of its competitive advantage and ensuring that it does not put itself at a disadvantage. We're talking about the big technological giants like the US and China. And of course, the issue of digital sovereignty comes to the fore when we talk about the position of Europe and the competence of Europe to hold its own and to be a strong player in the professional IT market. So we can look at the skills gap, and despite the growth in supply, despite all the efforts that we are making to increase the number of people joining the IT profession at a high level, the demand is continuously growing. And Europe will really need to continue with its efforts in ICT education and training at all levels, and continue to utilize the ability of its industry to find talent, and also to look outside of Europe to where we can bring in talent to add to the cohort of professionals that we have to meet the growing demand for IT professionals that are needed in Europe. Of course, after the pandemic that was a problem for all of us worldwide, a recovery and resilience plan was put in place for Europe with very strong goals that we wish to attain by 2030. And 20% of all of the effort and the finance for this plan is to be spent on digital transition and reform, with 4 cardinal points among the targets. So the targets are towards having a digitally skilled population, and that means digitally enabled citizens, but critically, it means that we want to have 20 million ICT specialists in Europe by 2030. That's starting from a low base point of less than 8 million in 2019. We're also aiming at having secure and high-performing, sustainable digital infrastructures in place. We need to ensure the digital transformation of businesses and the digitalization of public services. And of course, citizen skills are the key to making that element of it all work. My view personally is that citizen skills, user skills, and high-level professional skills are just part of a continuum, and that neither makes sense without the other. We have to look at the whole of society. So 2020 to 2030 is Europe's digital decade, and that's the period in which we need to attain these high-level objectives. But the success of Europe's digital decade will really depend on our ability to attract people into the IT profession and to raise that number from 8 million up to 20. So it requires a massive investment of effort and money and passion and just the drive which has been evident in Europe in order to make sure that we can attain the goals that we set for ourselves. But in setting high targets for the numbers of IT professionals, we need to also make sure that we have very high quality professionals, as well as having the quantity, the number that we need. We must match the quality to the quantity. So why do we have this shortage? Well, there have been so many investigations into the cause of the skills shortage and many, many initiatives to resolve it. Some of them have been successful, but ultimately none has found the golden bullet, if you like, to solve the problem completely. But we do need to put the emphasis, I believe, on professionalism and on the IT profession in order to achieve the numbers of professionals that we need. In the absence of a traditional and professional regulatory body, the concept of professionalism needs to be understood so that we can present our profession as a high status one that's well respected and that is founded on 4 solid pillars which give it strength. Of course, we've heard AJ talking very eloquently about the skills framework for the information age, Sophia. In Europe, we are more comfortable, I suppose, with the European e-competence framework, which is similar but different also. We're not going to go into a comparison of them, but they do, to some extent, they do a similar job. ECF is aligned for Europe with European policy, with the digital agenda, and also with the IT sovereignty goals, I suppose, from a European perspective. But the competence part of the 4 pillars that support professionalism are defined by the European e-competence framework. We also have the body of knowledge, which is a critical part of a professional cohort of fundamentals. We have a code of professional ethics, and we have a whole education and training set of standards around curriculum guidelines, which Rocco will talk about shortly, and metrics and indicators so that we can actually measure how competent individuals are. So all of this work is being standardized and is being presented for the profession as a set of professional standards to base the notion of professionalism on. The ECF is the common language for us regarding in the area of IT competence, and it's intended to be applied by public and private sector employers, higher education, vocational education, as well as assessment and accreditation bodies. So right across the board, the ECF is the foundation of the approach that we take to professionalism. And the collaboration in Europe to drive this professionalism agenda consists of a number of stakeholders. We have, of course, at the highest level, the European Commission, and that includes the Digital Skills and Jobs Coalition, which is a movement among countries to bring together and to share all of the initiatives around raising the level of digital competence at all levels, from users right up to the highest professionals. We have CEN, the European Standards Organization, and in particular, its Technical Committee 428, ICT Professionalism and Digital Competences, in which both Rocco and I participate very, very significantly. We have an organization called IT Professionalism Europe, which brings together a lot of people who are interested in it. We have professional bodies and, of course, the higher education sector. But just a quick word about each of these. The CEN Technical Committee consists of delegates from the national standards bodies across Europe, and it was established to create the standard of the European e-competence framework, because it is now a European standard, which is a very significant position for it to hold. The focus of the committee is on maturing the IT profession, and it's responsible for all standardization in relation to the IT profession. So establishing standards to guide the maturing of the profession in relation to the 4 agreed pillars of professionalism, this is really of enormous benefit to the professional stakeholder community across all sectors of business and economics. IT Professionalism Europe is an organization that was founded probably 10 years ago now, and it's a network of stakeholders committed to the advancement of IT professionalism. It includes public and private sector, the policy and standards, and HR and IT departments are all very much involved in it. And it works closely with the public sector and with people from the European Commission, European Parliament, and with similar bodies across Europe. And I do have to say a word about professional bodies, because, you know, even though our profession that we're all talking about isn't regulated, as I've said before, in the way other professions are, professional bodies are essential as a rallying point for people who are working in the profession. A professional body can speak to for the profession, but also to the public can guarantee the highest standards of delivery and of quality in terms of the work that is done. It can help to navigate a pathway for the profession in a changing landscape, because nothing stays the same in IT, but even society is changing so quickly in front of our eyes, socially, economically, from a sustainability point of view. We also know that there are many vulnerabilities in the digital space. We've mentioned the skills shortage. There's the digital divide. COVID, of course, caused us a lot of problems, which we're coming out of now, hopefully, and the issue of digital sovereignty, which is really important for Europe. Professional bodies also help to build trust, respect, and confidence, and it enables us to build on the strengths that we have. So I said we're not going to go into a very detailed description of the e-competence framework, but just very briefly, because Rocco will touch on this a little bit later again, there are 43 IT competences in this framework, described in 4 dimensions. So straight away you can see that there's a difference in the way it's structured in comparison to Sophia, which is a much higher number of what it calls skills. The 4 dimensions give us a kind of a navigation way through the framework. So we have the dimension 1 is the competence area. Dimension 2 is the title and general description of the competence. And then we have in dimension 3, as you can see there, the level descriptors, because there are 5 levels in the e-CF. And dimension 4 tries to make it a little bit more concrete and gives some knowledge and skills examples. And then we also have looked at some of what we call transversal aspects, which are not competences or skills per se, but are topics and aspects that are that really are knitted throughout the whole concept of a framework of competence. And they're listed there for you also. So in the context of e-CF, competence has a very precise definition. It's defined as a demonstrated ability to apply knowledge, skills, and attitudes for achieving observable results. And this is really a very holistic concept, and it's directly related to workplace activities and incorporating complex human behaviors expressed as embedded attitudes. And again, this is just a brief overview of what we call the IT professionalism ecosystem. And in the center, you can see the e-competence framework. This is the framework. The diagram isn't too dissimilar to the Sophia one you saw earlier. And to the left of that, you can see the professional role profiles. So we have a very clear definition of role profiles based on the competence framework. We have on the right-hand side, curriculum guidelines. Rocco will talk about those. We have reference on the top to the professional ethics framework. And of course, at the bottom, we have the body of knowledge represented there in that other diagram. And all of the different stakeholders are listed around the ovals there, where we can see that on the demand side, and we can see the supply side and the education part and market and policy, etc., all representing the interaction and codependency among each other with e-CF at the center. So just a final word, professionalism is really important in the work we're doing in Europe. We think it's the basis of everything. It's what is going to raise the profile of IT and attract in many young, bright people into work and to help us to attain that 20 million IT professionals by 2030. So professionalism, again, is focused on the 4 pillars, and it looks carefully at standards and at best practice. There's a brochure, the link to which is there in the slide, so you'll be able to get that afterwards, which is looking at professionalism and some of the key characteristics of it. But my last slide is just on professional practice, because professional practice is really the key. It's really what it's all about, because when we talk about professionalism representing standards, we have to remember that standards are regulations, and they're the rules that help us to figure out how we're going to operate. But these standards have to be translated into action, and that action is what we call professional practice. So professional practice in our IT arena is a set of common behaviors by IT workers that implement the standards that we've developed. And they cover things like, the approach to work and career, routine decision-making and interpersonal relationships, emphasis on competent and careful individual practice and collective action to ensure that the profession is recognized and respected. And these are elements that are absolutely essential alongside the technical skills and technical competence that professionals have. They need to be able to operate in a way that shows them to be highly trustworthy and important players in the social, economic and political lives of our countries. So I'm going to stop there, and I think I'll stop sharing, and I think Rocco will share his slides now, and he'll continue with the next part of this presentation. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for your introduction and your great presentation as usual. And I will continue. And I hope everybody can see my screen. So before starting, I want to thank the organizer, and especially Keiko Tanaka, the organizer of this very interesting international workshop. And my presentation here today, the goal of my presentation is to show to you what the CEN TC 428, the Technical Committee on IT Professionalism, what is doing in the field of industry-academia collaboration. In order to do that, I will present you an initiative, curriculum guidelines, that we have developed during the last 3 years. Mary showed us the 4 pillars of IT professionalism, and the initiative I am presenting now to you is part of education and training pillar. Maybe it's useful for you to know that in Europe we started many years ago to develop IT professionalism, as Mary said, and the first pillar to be developed was the competencies one, and we built the e-competency framework, as Mary said, and now Scientist C428 is enriching and building on the other pillars, so education and training, bodies of knowledge, and professional ethics. So European effort in these years is focused on developing and fostering the other pillar and keeping the link with the competence one, because as Mary said, this is an entire ecosystem and it's well interconnected. So what is ICT curriculum guidelines? The ICT curriculum guidelines for e-competencies and digital leadership is a technical specification that provides guidelines on how to design, develop, maintain, adjust, and compare ICT curricula for e-competence and digital leadership, e-competence professional and digital leadership, as scoped by the European ICT professionalism framework and its basic component. So this is the goal of this document. What is a technical specification? A technical specification is a pre-standard, so is something that is less strong than a standard, but is necessary to build consensus and can become a standard in the future. In my presentation, I will share with you some information about this initiative, both in terms of methodology, in terms of content, and also some lesson learned at the end of my presentation. So before going into the content, I would like to start with the methodology. This is very important because if you want to have a strong collaboration between industry and academia, it's a key ingredient of the recipe. Is to have both of them on board to build the new standard, to agree. And in fact, the initiative had a very high attention to stakeholder engagement and to have a very high level of collaboration. How did we work on this? First of all, there was a selection of experts coming from all Europe, 8 experts from different countries, representing different kinds of organization, including academia, of course, standards organization, and small and medium industry organization. And they have worked together for more than 2 years to develop the document. So first ingredient of the recipe is an international and rich team, not too big, 8 people. I had the privilege to be the team leader, 8 people that work together and write a document, bringing different experiences and bringing different approach. Second ingredient, you can see here on the screen, one of the workshop we had is to put a lot of attention to stakeholder engagement in terms of informing and all the stakeholder of our progresses, and also to get suggestion from all the stakeholder. I would like to show you also, before going into the content, The timeline of the project here, that is another important part of the methodology. As you can see, we worked for 2.5 years. The technical specification is now under the formal approval process, is expected to be published this year, at the end, before the end of this year. And as you can see from this Gantt diagram, a lot of attention has been dedicated to stakeholder engagement and dissemination, is the second row. And then, of course, the team worked to research, to collect all the requirements, to listen a lot, because if you want that the academia and the industry together embrace something, of course, they need to be part of the game from the very beginning. And of course, we succeed only partially, because we also had a timeline to respect, but a very good effort of stakeholder engagement has been done. After all, after that there is a technical specification writing phase, and again validation testing. So I want to show you that it's really important to have an active participation in order to have then a good collaboration. I stop here with methodology, and I want to show you the expectation that we had during our conversation with all stakeholders. So we had many interviews and questionnaires, and to the question to what extent the ICT curriculum guidelines can provide benefit to the following activities, you can see that there are a lot of very high expectation in the support that this document can give to the formulation of learning outcomes. So formulation of learning outcomes is something that academia really wants to do, avoiding to be self-referential. So I spoke to some important representative of academia, and the key topic was we don't want to be self-referential. Of course, we do have experience, we do know the content, the topic, but we want to refer to something that is a little bit considered standard, of course, in the IT sector. The second element is to support to check the presence of important elements of curriculum, so universities and education institution in general want to use these curriculum guidelines a little bit as a checklist in order to be sure not to forget important elements. Another very important aspect and expectation is connected to curriculum mapping for comparison, because in many institutions, in many education institutions, of course you have the same name, the same courses, but they can have different content, as you know, or the opposite. You can have very different naming of the same thing. So it's really needed a way to compare the curricula, not based on the title or the name, but going into the content. And then other expectation, I don't want to go one by one, but those are the most important. The fourth one is to have a curriculum example and so on. What is the other expectation that we had from the standardization environment? The standardization environment that Mary illustrated a few minutes ago, she defined it as an ecosystem. So the expectation was that from each one, each entry point of this ecosystem, we need to have a connection to a learning program, a curriculum. And the most important aspect of the ecosystem so far are the competence. One second, I want to take. Okay, the competence from e-CF. So this is can be a starting point, but another starting point can be the role profiles. So you can start by competence, by role, by knowledge, or using the assessment. From each one of these aspects of the ecosystem, from which one of these perspective, we need to compare to have a link to the learning program. And the team worked a lot on this and found a solution on the educational profile. So the core of ICT curriculum guidelines technical specification is the educational profile that provides a scheme to a standard scheme to connect all these elements to the curriculum and to represent also the link. I will show you now the structure of educational profile to you. So the description, of course, is the title. And includes the goal of the profiles in terms of result, the scope, and this is very important because the scope contains the connection to the e-CF area, because it's very important that the educational profile works a little bit as a link, a reference, a connection to the e-competency framework. Of course, an indication of relevant competencies, an indication of the level of complexity and autonomy of the profile. So because these guidelines refer to different level of education, higher education. An example of deliverables that the profile should be able to master, a professional perspective and an educational perspective. So all these aspects are a description, and this scheme is the standard that CENTI C428 is proposing to the educational environment in order to have the possibility to compare different profile. Of course, we have details about the learning outcome. Learning outcomes are different one and can be structured in different way, but it's important that they are part of the profile because they contain the content in terms of knowledge and skills that are and competencies that are required and are part of the profile. The last part of the education profile refers to assessment, because assessment is an important part of the game and includes also an indication about the kind of assessment that can be better used for that specific education profile. About the assessment, Mary already said that there is another important project of CENTI C428 that is focusing on providing indication on e-CF performance indication and common metrics, the metrics to use, the methods to use to assess people. Before I close, I have a final consideration I want to show with you. and it refers a little bit to the business model of standardization. So standardization is something that is at the end of the day connected to certification, and when you talk about people, you can have of course the certification of people in terms of professionalism, in terms of roles, or you can have the certification of curricula in terms of having respected a standard in the design and of that curricula in the training. So between standardization and certification, in the middle, between standardization and certification, we have training and assessment. So we need to what is CEN/TC 428 doing in Europe? We set the standards, the rules, and we started many years ago by competencies and role. So we have the standard, the references. We are now working on the pillar of training and assessment. I am referring now just to education because CEN is doing also other things with ethics and knowledge, but I am now referring only to the education field. And we are developing guidelines for training and guidelines for assessment. And in the right part of my slide, there is certification, because certification is certainly the future, and is also the element that sustain the business model in terms also of sustainability, economical sustainability. So because certification is where we also have the business. What are the key ingredients, the secret, the key of each one of these elements? For standardization, I believe the key is relevance, especially of the institution. So it's important that we refer to the official institution. In Europe, we had a lot of effort in the past to define standard from small association, small university, and that's not the road. So if you want to standardize, you need to have the right hat, and the CEN is the right hat because it's the European official standardization agency, and it's one for all Europe, and we have to refer to CEN. So it needs to be relevant, the standardization. The training, of course, need to be effective, so and connected to the standard, and this is the effort of ICT curriculum guidelines. So the key for success in training, one of the key for success is effectiveness of training in building the right professional. And when we move to assessment, I believe the key is to be able to be neutral, because especially when you have to assess people, there is a lot of literature on this field, and you all know how difficult it is to stick to neutrality when you have to refer to human beings. The last aspect with certification, what is the key, in my opinion, is the recognition. So in other terms, the value of the certification in the market. So this is important, especially when the certificate or the certified people is recognized by the market, in the tender, by the public authorities. And so I think CEN is working in the future to build and to strengthen also this aspect. I stop here, and I really thank you for your kind attention.
メリーさん、ロコさん、ありがとうございました。本講演では時間や言語の制約からライブでの質疑応答ができません。 ご質問は IT 連盟 IT 教育人材育成委員会事務局までメールでお寄せいただくか、Q&A の機能からお寄せください。お二人のお話を通してヨーロッパでは、一般市民のデジタルリテラシーの向上と ICT 専門職業人の供給が地続きの課題として認識されていること、そして IT 分野で働く人たちのプロフェッショナリズムを非常に重視されているということを伺うことができました。その際に産業界、大学、認証評価機関、職業訓練や研修のいずれにおいても e-CF を共通言語として参照していくよう取り組んでいることもお話しいただきました。ロコさんの講演のスライドの最後の方では、その人材育成していく最後のところでですね、標準化を行って、それが能力の証明として、資格証書、認定証という形で、能力を認定していく、それが循環していくことによって人材を育成するという様子が描かれておりました。次のセッション3では、実際に教育を受けた証明や職場で発行された認定証などのスキルの証明について、デジタルテクノロジーを応用することでいかに円滑に信頼性の高いものにするか、イルディコ・マダールさんにお話しいただきます。日本では進学や転職をしようと思うときには、どうしてもまだ紙の履歴書を使う機会が少なくありません。一方、ヨーロッパでは欧州共通履歴書、ユーロパスと呼ばれるデジタルなツールが普及してきました。そのユーロパスにデジタル署名技術を使い、資格やスキルなど学んだ成果をお財布のようにして貯めておき、いざ転職などの際に採用企業の人事にセキュアにシェアできる European Digital Credential for Learning Infrastructure という基盤が新たに開発されました。本日はこの European Digital Credential Infrastructure の導入を担当されておりますイルディコ・マザールさんにブリュッセルからご講演いただきます。それでは、イルディコさん、画面の共有、カメラのオンをお願いいたします。
Okay, I find on mute. Thank you very much for the floor, Keiko, and it is an absolute pleasure to join this international webinar today and tell you about the European Digital Credentials for Learning and Europass. My presentation is probably going to be an excellent segue or continuation of what we heard before. I will also talk a lot about standards, and I will also talk a lot about how courses and certification can help individuals and citizens to find jobs and how employers can find good matches for vacancies. Very quickly, I am Ildiko Mazar. I am representing NTT Data, that is the subcontractor who's carrying out the work on behalf of the European Commission to develop and maintain and support the European Digital Credentials infrastructure. And today I'm going to tell you some details about this. Just like the other speakers, I'm going to share the slides after the presentation. So some of the links that are available on the slides, and I won't be able to go into too much details, you will be able to click on them and consult some of the resources. I will start by a short introduction of key concepts and a policy background about how Europass and the digital credentials came to existence. And I will then dive into more details about our standard, the European learning model, that is now considered the single EU standard to describe any aspects of learning. And then I'm going to show you how a digital credential is built, what components it has, how it operates, and how it can be used. And I will close my presentation with a screenshot of what the credential sharing from the individual's point of view would look like. So just a few definitions at the start. A credential is basically a documented statement about claims about an individual. It could be your certificate of vaccination, it could be your driving license, it could be your credential as a journalist if you want to go to press conferences. What we call the European Digital Credential for Learning, it's a more specific claim that is related to the learning achievement of an individual. And what is also very important as a component of these credentials is that we use digital signatures or so-called electronic seals to guarantee the origin and the integrity of the document. These e-seals are basically the digital equivalents of an organization's rubber stamp. And this is where I'm not going to be able to go into very many details, but I would really like to point out the relevance of the European Digital Credentials and our data model as a central core to EU policy agenda. The initiative has been developed based on calls, requirements and demands set out by European initiatives such as the Digital Education Action Plan, the European Skills Agenda and the Europass decision. And we are connected very much to other relevant EU initiatives and nurturing collaboration with other agencies, DGs, and initiatives to support micro-credential recognition, building individual learning accounts, and basically just to be a part of the European education area by 2025. Why do we need a digital credential initiative to begin with? The objectives would be to empower citizens to own their own credentials. So it will be shifted the focus from the institutions who are issuing credentials to the citizen, who can then use them freely and at any time without having to consult issuing organization. To reduce market fragmentation that is caused by the previous decades initiatives that were growing individually and independently from each other. Creating a single European skills data space is very important so that people can relate to that and connect to that. Make digital credentials multilingual by default. And this is a very important point, as previous speakers already pointed out, from the point of view of recognition. Using standards as well as using multiple languages to express learning helps remove barriers to credential recognition, whether it's the learner trying to enroll in further education or would like to get their credentials recognized in a different country or recognized by an employer. This is a very important consideration. And to provide accreditation and transparency tool. As we heard again before, very often, depending on the nature of the credential, it's very important that credential viewers can determine whether the program or the issuing organization has accredited status to and have the legal allowance to issue certain types of credentials. Subsequently or consequently, the benefits that individuals and organizations can enjoy is that our data model and the credentials can capture both formal and non-formal learning and even informal learning. And this is a big challenge, or was a big challenge when we developed the European learning model, because of course we wanted to make sure that everything and everybody is included. So we have to address all levels of education, all sectors of education, higher education, as well as vocational education, all sizes, macro, micro, to apply the European learning model to the entire life cycle of learning, so that learners can find standard compliant descriptions of learning opportunities available online, as well as receive credentials that include references to the same standard. We want it to be interoperable with existing standards and infrastructures and align with European recognition instruments. And of course, as the EU does, the tools, services, and the code is all free and open. So zooming in a little bit on the benefits from the different stakeholders' point of view, citizens can build an online portfolio using Europass, and they can track their learning journeys alongside their lives. Previously, a learning management system would only be restricted to the institution, one single institution offering learning. Now learners can use a single access point. They can utilize their credentials to get jobs or apply for further training. They can present and have their credentials verified automatically and instantly at any point of their career. At the same time, learning organizations can build EU standard compliant credentials. They can reduce their costs of credential building and issuing. Now, there's an initial investment, obviously, to familiarize themselves with the standard and to learn the practices and develop the methodologies and the processes within an institution, how to build these credentials. But after this initial investment, transforming from paper to digital has great advantages. And of course, they can better understand credentials from other member states, thanks to using not just the standards, but that the content is available and can be navigated in 29 languages. From the point of view of employers, they can reduce time and cost of processing job applications. There nowadays, when people can apply for jobs online, there's lots of applications reaching HR departments, and to sift through them and find correct and matching candidates for vacancies is very difficult if it has to be done by just random algorithms or humans. Employers can also better understand the credentials that are presented from outside of their country because of the use of standards and the languages, and they can immediately see on the instant and automatic authentication and verification checks if a credential has expired, if the credential has been tampered with, or if the credential is coming from an accredited organization. Europass as the big infrastructure is more than what you might remember being a CV designer. It's also an info site. It has an e-portfolio where citizens can build their profiles. It has digital skill self-assessment tests embedded. It's connected to a database or two or three databases that permit users to search for jobs, qualifications, and courses. And of course, what we're talking about today is use the component of digital credentials to store credentials. We encourage and foster interoperability by encouraging users to apply our data model, the European learning model, to describe learning, whether it's the courses or the credentials. It's really useful to use the data model. This is possible by two means: using the existing services that are available online and accessible from the Europass website, or use the free open code to customize and develop their own applications, their own issuer, their own viewer, and their own wallet services. The advantage of using the data model and Europass is that there is already 4 million, actually over 4 million registrations, which means that 4 million plus users already have a readily available Europass wallet that could receive the standard compliant digital credentials. And of course, we have the provision of access to qualification and awarding body data through our databases. Okay. So how a European digital credential is built? We have various applications of the data model. So it's not just the credentials. These letters stand for the qualifications, accreditation, learning opportunity, and what I'm talking about is the European Digital Credentials for Learning. The ontology and the data model allows us to break the credential down. It's something very similar to what Rocco presented earlier, but a bit more sophisticated. We also describe activities, learning activities, that could be like 150 hours of coursework or 100 hours of apprenticeship. We describe learning achievements, and these learning achievements are connected to learning outcomes. And the learning outcomes can be connected to knowledge, skills, and competences, usually from established frameworks and classifications, once again, to connect existing frameworks and standards. So learning outcomes could be learning outcome of a skill of painting or a final examination of grade B, because the assessment, of course, as we heard from Rocco before, is a crucial element of the data to prove how the acquisition of learning outcomes was assessed and just to prove that the person who's presenting a credential has indeed truly achieved those learning outcomes. Then what we call entitlements can be an entitlement to work as a painter once you have the right credentials, or it could be an entitlement to enroll in further education. If you have a bachelor's degree, you can go forward and enroll in master's education, or with a master's, you can enroll in PhD. And what we are also going to work on in the near future is attestations, which in layman's term means recognition certificates of qualifications, for example, from a different country. The infrastructure components of the EDCI are standards, services, and software. And to greater details, the standards would be the European learning model itself, also interoperability standards that permit and allow the deposit of credentials into wallets and sending and issuing. The services I mentioned before that are already implemented by Europass itself and available for the greater public is the EDC issuer, the wallet, the viewer. We have an accreditation database. We have a course and qualification search, and we have open data services. And for software and support, we have eIDAS and EDC code libraries. The code is available in the shape of Docker images, but also available on GitHub for IT experts to download and customize. We have a so-called qualifications dataset register, where member states are storing and publishing information about national qualifications. We also have a sandbox that we call the playground, where newcomers, new prospective implementers can explore the use of our available tools before they commit to using the production environment. We have API libraries, and we have a help desk to serve our implementers and answer questions as they emerge. With regards to the functions of the system, we have issuing function to make sure that the credentials are built based on the data model and they're format compliant, and they are being sent to their owners. The owners are able to use the system function of storing credentials in their wallet. This can be online, offline, and doesn't have to be Europass. We have the verification checks, or the service or function that verifies the authenticity and the validity of the organization who's issuing a credential and the credential itself. And of course, we have the share function that allows individuals to share one or more of their existing credentials for learning application or a job application as they find it fit. It's all controlled by the owner. Just to dive a little deeper into why this is so important and what the benefits are compared to today's paper-based credentials. If you have to store a paper-based diploma, for example, you can misplace it. It takes a long time to get a replacement if you lose it. The credential issuer or owner would have to either pick it up from the awarding body at an awarding ceremony, or would have to receive it by a registered mail. And of course, we have to make sure that they are safely stored and not misplaced and not lost. If you have a European Digital Credential for Learning or a standard compliant credential, you can receive the credential instantly from the credential issuer, either by email or by direct deposit. This would be similar to, the concept is similar to money transfer. If the issuing organization knows the wallet address of the credential recipient, they can just deposit the credential there. The individual has to do nothing. When next time they go to their Europass profile and check their wallet, the credential will be there waiting for them, and they can open and share it freely as they like. And these are stored there securely and virtually infinitely until the end of times. And we make sure that the verification is always available, even 10, 20 years down the line. I would like to point out there is no obligation to use the Europass wallet. Europass is just the first implementer. But if somebody, an institution, is using the code to customize and build their own standard compliant wallet, then a credential owner can store their credential in any standard compliant wallet. And with regards to sharing, a paper-based credential would have to be requested from the issuing organization, maybe get it notarized or get an apostille for the credential and send it either by registered mail or deliver in person when they have a job interview. This can be a lengthy process. If a job applicant would like to share a digital credential, they can just select the credential they wish to share, create a share link that can expire, so you can make sure that the credential is not abused by the receiver of the credential. If you have an application deadline for a job post, for example, you can set an expiry to the link the day after the deadline, so that you can make sure that the link is only live and available for the period of time that the user set. Once again, no obligation to use the Europass wallet. Link can be shared to any cloud-based wallet. So a few examples of how these credentials look like, because they can, as I mentioned during one of my first slides, credentials can describe formal or non-formal learning. Most importantly, qualifications that are so important for job applications can be expressed in the form of digital credentials, but you can also create a certificate of activity. For example, I could issue you all a certificate of participation after this webinar. We can focus on claims that are assessment specific, for example, transcripts of records, and entitlements. Some claims are simply an entitlement that would say that a person who receives this credential has the right to enroll in a learning opportunity or undertake a certain occupation. So as you can see, there's a lot of freedom to use the data model, and this has been a very important consideration when we made the design and we built the data model. And there are a few examples on the screen to show you how customizable the credentials are. Needless to say that behind these pretty images, what matters most is the data, the metadata of the credential, but the credential issuers are usually quite pleased to see that there's an opportunity to resemble the look and feel of their paper-based credentials before somebody starts, whether a machine or a human starts browsing the content. I mentioned that we have a lot of properties. It's a huge data model that was developed over years, but it's also important to point out that for issuers, in order to issue digitally signed credentials that are standard compliant, there are only a handful of compulsory pieces of information that they need to supply. This is also very important from the point of view of accommodating the different types of credentials I mentioned on the previous slide. So we have to have an issuer of the credential. Without an issuer, there's obviously no issued credential. Every claim has to have a designated recipient, so the credential has to have a recipient. The credential has to have a credential type. It has to have a title. The issuer has to specify the valid from date. This is not the timestamp when the issuer issues the credential. It is the date from which the credential is valid. This is a W3C standard requirement, and it really just means that, for example, a university can issue credentials retrospectively. So I could receive my diploma that I got in 2002, and I ask the university to issue it today. I would still have the valid from date from 2002. And of course, one of the hearts of the digital credential that allows it to have legal value is the qualified or advanced electronic seal that we always check with the authentication and verification checks every time the credential is viewed. A little bit more about these authentication and verification checks. As I mentioned, these are instant and automatic. Every time that the credential is opened by a third-party viewer or the credential holder, they will be able to see if the credential is format compliant, if the seal is still intact. These credentials by the technical format are XML files at the moment. We are just moving into using JSON format. But if anybody tampers with the file and changes a single digit in the code, the next time they view the credential, the seal check will fail. this is just to show that somebody tampered with the credential. So the right term to use for our credential is not that they are tamper-proof, nothing is, but they are tamper-evident. So if anybody tampers with a credential, that's clearly visible. We are working on the revocation. For some universities, they may lose their license, or they could be diploma mills or wouldn't have accreditation status that allows them to issue certain qualifications. So if a credential is revoked for plagiarism or something like that, we will be able to compare the credentials with the registered database of revoked credentials. And one check that may or may not apply to some credentials is accreditation status. So if we are looking at the qualification, then the program or the institution needs to have an accredited status. And we have the accreditation database to which this check is comparing the credentials issuer. And of course, the validity in the case of the qualifications, this does not apply, but there are certain types of credentials such as driving licenses or nurse certificates that would need to be renewed periodically. So if a credential expires in 3 years' time from its valid from date, then you check the validity the day before the expiration date, you get a green check. You check the day after, it's a red cross. A little bit about the richness of the data model. There are 443 properties that help you describe learning. This is an awful lot, but practically nobody would have to use all 443 properties to describe a credential. And nevertheless, in addition to those compulsory properties that I showed you before, they are able to use other properties to describe organizations, details of the credential owner. This could be whatever you would like to supply to make the credential owner identifiable and verifiable. You can use date of birth or address, passport number, ID number, whatever you like. There are lots of properties that you can specify. Something that I think is most exciting and interesting is how you can describe achievements. And this is where I could mention that although our data model is putting a lot of focus on using references to existing European frameworks and classifications. So for example, EQF and NQF levels, which are the European Qualification Framework and National Qualification Framework levels. We use UNESCO controlled vocabularies, for example, the ISCAT field of education codes. And if, in case you're not familiar with ESCO, this is the European classification of skills, qualifications, and occupations. And they have a massive taxonomy of almost 14,000 skills that we can refer to in the metadata or the content of the credential. And this is just what we have readily available. As you can, I don't know if the screen is too small or not, but towards the end of or the bottom of the slide, you can see that related ESCO skills are highlighted. So we give a specific importance to ESCO skills. And you can reference, now I won't be able to click, but these are clickable concepts. And if somebody who's consulting the content of this credential would like to learn more about the skill of use mathematical tools and equipment, they can click on that concept title and they will be taken to a new window in their browser and they can read more about the concept. They can change the language of the concept and consult it in any of the, I think, 27 languages ESCO has. But if we don't just operate with ESCO, related skills can be referred to from any framework that is available as linked open data or even not as linked open data. So for example, the DigComp framework can be consulted. I imagine the CC 2020 or the CIA can be also referenced using the data model. So really this can demonstrate how much we try to be allowing and incorporating anything that users may wish to use to describe credentials, and we didn't want to be too restrictive. We also need to mention the importance of assessment and activities. Assessment can be really important from the point of view, as I mentioned before, to describe neutrally, as Rocco put it, the assessment. We have a whole class to describe assessment with the provision of used grading schemes and their description, what a grading scale would mean compared to like a 0 to 100%. We have a property to describe individuals' identification and supervision of assessment. Needless to say that it's important to know whether the person who went under assessment was supervised and ID verified or not. There are types of assessment. Was it just a quiz? Was it an oral presentation? We have lots of properties that issuers can use to dive deeper into the assessment description. But of course, as I mentioned before, this is mostly optional. And then just a final slide on how credentials are shared. As I mentioned before, if I'm in my Europass e-library, I can select 1 or 2 or as many credentials as I would like to share. I am taken to a share screen where I can set the valid until date when the share link would expire, and get an automatically generated link that I can add to my job application or send by email. And finally, just a couple of words about what we're planning for the future. We are continuing a many year process of offering more features. We are going to develop an archive wallet. We are working on credential re-signing. Familiar European documents such as certificate supplement and Europass mobility supplement will be available as special credential types. I mentioned the attestations, which are the recognition statements, and the revocation list, and qualification templates, and very importantly, a data model browser, because this beast of a standard with its 443 properties is really hard to take in unless you're an expert. And having a user-friendly data model browser might be able to show you a greater or more relatable and accessible picture of how these concepts of learning outcomes and related skills and achievements and entitlements relate to each other and are able to build a credential. And this is pretty much it. We have a functional mailbox where you can reach us if you have any questions, and we would be very happy to hear from you. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you very much for your attention.
ありがとうございました。EDCI の導入で個人にとっては自分の学習成果を保存管理できること、それから検証可能性が担保された視覚情報を特定の相手とシェアすることで、新たに職に就いたり進学したりするのに活用できる信頼性のあるデータ流通基盤になっていることが伺えました。さて、ヨーロッパではちょうどお昼の時間になりました。ただいま日本は時刻7時を回ったところかと思います。最後のセッションはアメリカ・ワシントン DC から先進的な仕組みをご紹介いただきます。あいにく時差の関係でビデオでのご講演とさせていただきます。本日ご紹介いただくのは、教育や研修などによる個人の学習記録をセマンティックウェブ技術とブロックチェーン技術との組み合わせにより、採用の合理化につなげる取り組みです。ご講演いただくのは、アメリカ商工会議所財団で、教育及び労働力開発に取り組むバイスプレジデントのジェイソン氏から、データ標準と Web3 テクノロジーの応用を通じて、官民データの相互運用性を支援することについてご講演いただきます。さて、Web3 というと昨今話題に欠かない NFT を想起されるかもしれませんので、少し補足させていただきます。講演テーマの背景となっているのが2018年アメリカ商工会議所が公開したホワイトペーパー Web3 ポイントテクノロジーの応用によるタレントマーケットプレイスの向上というものです。2018年ですので、当時は Web3 みたいな言い方はされておりませんで、ここで指している技術、Web3.0 という言葉が指している技術は、セマンティックウェブ技術、 分散レジャーテクノロジー、大規模データ解析、AI や機械学習といったものを指しておりました。Web3 を応用して人材育成を加速させようというアメリカ商工会議所財団が始めたプロジェクト T3 イノベーションネットワークについて今回の講演では中心的にお話しいただく予定です。この T3 イノベーションネットワークの取り組みが始まる以前からアメリカ商工会議所ではデータを活用した人材育成に取り組んできました。2014年には不足する人材を供給すべく、採用側の求める人材の資格やコンピテンスを明確にし、その情報に基づいた教育を行うタレントパイプラインマネジメント。2017年からは、ジョブディスクリプションの記述を明確にするため、コンピテンシーやタクソノミーを整理して、人事管理システムとのデータ連携を目指したジョブレジストリー。そして、ルミナ財団が様々な資格情報のカタログ化を行ったクレデンシャルレジストリーという取り組みがございました。これらの取り組みの背景にあるのが、アメリカにおける次のような採用に関する課題意識です。採用において、求職者は自身のスキルや能力を示すのに履歴書や職務経歴書に頼っていますが、個人の学習成果や業績を適切に認知することは困難であり、記述されたスキルや資格について普遍的な共通理解がなく、その真偽を検証する手段がありませんでした。先ほどヨーロッパのイルディコさんのお話の中で、この検証性の担保というところについてお話しいただきましたけれども、この学歴ですとか職務経歴というものが、ちゃんと検証できるということが問題意識として、高まってきたというのが一つございました。それからですね、採用企業はあるポストに1人を採用するのに平均で42日、4129ドルのコストがかかっており、そういったコストの面で非常に困っていたというのがございます。それから新たなスキルがどんどんテクノロジーの進展によって生まれてくるので、旧体以前の学位や資格では表現されにくい新たなスキルを認定する体制が整備されていない、このような課題意識を持っておりました。で、これを踏まえてですね、学習と職務の履歴をデジタルに一括で管理する LER、ラーニング&エンプロイメントレコードというものを T3 イノベーションが開発してまいりました。それではセッション4の講演を同時通訳チャンネルからご覧ください。
Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Tishko, and I'm Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And I'm delighted to bring to you today this presentation, which I am going to pull up now. There we go. So today I'm going to be talking about how we're supporting the digital transformation of the talent marketplace through data interoperability. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about my organization. I work with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the world's largest business federation. We represent over 1,500 state and local chambers of commerce, and our reach is over 3 million firms. But today I'm bringing you a presentation that's on our foundation side of the house, which is our nonprofit affiliate. There we have a social impact mission. And my team is specifically looking at how we can improve our education and workforce systems through employer leadership. So we have many different pillars of our work, but the one I'm focusing on today is the one you see on the left-hand side of the screen, which is how we're modernizing our education and workforce data systems. We also do a number of things around employer-led partnerships, improving the quality of our programs, and also how we're driving innovative financing so people can have a more affordable education with less debt, and that could achieve better outcomes. So we do many different things, but today I'm going to be focused on what we're doing around modernizing data. And we believe we're in an economy where data is king. And data is going to increasingly disrupt our education and workforce systems. So we need data working on behalf of learners and workers as well as employers. But the good news is a lot of work's been done to date, particularly in the United States. We've closed a lot of the data gaps that are out there, but many remain. So work remains to be done, particularly when it comes to better sharing out information about the learning outcomes associated with a given program or credential, or better data about jobs. So we really could do a better job there. So we have launched an effort back in 2018. I'll get to the history in just a second, but we launched this effort called the T3 Innovation Network. The T stands for talent, the 3 for Web 3.0. And what the T3 Innovation Network is all about is facilitating the digital transformation of the talent marketplace. And we have 3 big goals in mind. The first is to make all learning count and to render that learning as data that could be transacted across all of our platforms. Number 2, that we can make competencies and skills like currency, meaning they could be rendered as data that can not only be transacted, but translated. And then number 3, that we're empowering learners and workers with data. And one of the interesting parts of T3 is we're trying to work across domain. A lot of these conversations often happen in silos within secondary education or post-secondary education, or within the business community or within government. And what T3 tries to do is be cross-domain, meaning we bring employers, educators, government, and the technology partners to serve them all together through collective action. So we will work together in furtherance of this digital transformation, because there are many things we think are not going to be a product problem that could be solved. This is a data infrastructure problem that's going to take all of us working together to create a more public-private, decentralized, and distributed data infrastructure for the education and workforce space. As I mentioned, T3 started back in 2018, where we came up with a report on how to achieve data interoperability in the talent marketplace. We then spent 2 years following that, implementing up to 8 projects that were in furtherance of that roadmap. And then recently in 2021, we launched what we call the Network of Networks, which was to provide a little bit more structure than having a loose collection of projects. And we've now created 4 founding data infrastructure networks, one of which is focused on data and technology standards, another on open competency frameworks, another one on learning and employment records, and a final one on jobs and workforce data. So each of these are communities of practice that are trying to kind of manage data interoperability within them. But the beauty of T3 is we're trying to promote cross-fertilization across them, because we know that decisions made in one affect the other, and we want to make sure that we're not only working across domain, education to employment, but we're also making sure folks that are solving aspects of this data infrastructure are able to work together. For example, we like to say T3 is standards-based, vendor-neutral, and use case-driven. Well, use cases developed in one often impact all of them. So we're all about opening up the lines of communication so that we can work in a public-private way to achieve data interoperability for the talent marketplace. There are these 4 networks, and I kind of gave you a brief description. I'm going to share this slide deck with you. So if you want to go back and read more about them and what their focus is, that information is available to you. They also have chartered work groups. So each network has 1 or more work groups that they've launched, which are smaller groups of individuals who are really coming together to address a particular focus or aspect of a mission within that network. And all of them are working to develop use cases that are informing our investments and work. One of the things that we're focusing a lot of attention on in the T3 Innovation Network is what we call LERs, or Learning and Employment Records. Think of this as the digital transcript of the future. If you believe all learning should count, that learning should be captured in the form of a record that could be connected to an individual that they could then use and be empowered by when pursuing continuing education or employment opportunities. But there are many defining characteristics of an LER that I want to briefly cover with you. One is we believe these new records that are really going to empower learners and workers need to be standards-based. And what we mean by that is they're based on a data standard that provides structure to the data within it. We need to move beyond image files like we had back with the badge movement and move more into structured machine actionable data. Vendor neutral, another key aspect. We're not trying to lock people into a single vendor or technology stack, but we want to make sure to the extent we're generating these new records of learning and employment that they could be issued by multiple vendors and that there is no lock-in on the user side. Verifiable. What we mean by that is you can make trusted claims that could be delivered about what someone knows and is able to do. So somebody can verify that you have certain skills or competencies, and that builds trust within the LER infrastructure. Content rich. What we mean by that is it's not just generic information, but rich information about skills and competencies that the individual possesses. I mentioned machine actionable. We need to make sure that this is the record itself and the contents within it can be processed as data, not as an image file or as an attachment like we used to do it, but as data that can be taken action on within another system like a human resource information system. Self-sovereign. Individuals are given control over their records once they possess them, including who sees what and when. Interoperable. Records need to move seamlessly across digital wallets, across IT platforms, and various technology stacks. This is very similar to vendor neutral. We need to make sure the data can move seamlessly, and we're getting out of the old way of doing things, as I mentioned before, where you're sending attachments that cannot be processed by a lot of our platforms. And last but not least, equitable. We need to make sure as we're developing this next generation of record that it's going to be equally distributed across all populations, most especially those opportunity populations that face barriers to education and employment. We can't be developing this new data infrastructure and LERs to benefit those who need it the least. We need to make sure that those who need it the most are at the front of the line in terms of benefiting from this kind of innovation. One thing I want to emphasize when it comes to these learning and employment records is they are not inherently a resume, which is often, they're often mistaken as such. But what we're working on in T3 is to really point out that if you want true skills-based hiring and career advancement with employers, these records need to be machine actionable, but they also have to be ingestible, which means we need what's called a resume profile specification that would allow an individual to take data elements from one or more LERs to assemble a resume presentation. And that resume presentation in that format could then be machine actionable with the HRIS system. So it can actually process what's inside and actually compare what someone knows and is able to do through that resume profile specification to what's inside of the job to assess for fit. This is a real critical almost like middleware type solution for how to make LERs work for employers. The good news is the T3 Innovation Network has identified this as one of those gaps, and we are collaborating with HR Open Standards Consortium to build this resume profile specification, and it will be available early next year. Another thing I wanted to point out in this presentation is that we're supporting the skills data workflow for LERs, not just for them, but if LERs need to be content rich, we need to be making sure that we're putting structured data about skills within them. But that's easier said than done. And we envision an entire workflow process here that involves standardization. So we need data standards for how we structure data about skills and skill frameworks. We need conversion tools, because think of all of the skill and competency data that's out there today that's not structured. We need an easy way to take that unstructured skills data and make it structured skills data that could be available to us today. But we can't ignore everything we have. We need to convert what we have from unstructured to structured, but then we need to author new. So how are we, whoever is involved in authoring new skills or competencies, they're not producing them as unstructured data like the old days, but anything new that gets produced is being authored as structured skills data. But then we can have all this data, but how do we find it? That comes to curation. So how are we able to store and make available these skills and skill frameworks widely? So they need to be put into something called a node or a library, where you can house one or many frameworks that someone can go access and find. But having a bunch of libraries might not be the most practical thing, because how do I know where to go to find the skill or framework that's most important to me? We need to support this skills data workflow through search, the power of search. So how are we making it as easy as possible for an individual to search for skill collections and skill frameworks by visiting one library and accessing all of them? And then there's use, because having all of this great skills data just sitting out there is doing nobody any good unless the end user can extract data from it to produce some kind of product or service. So this is where we get into applications that's able to take structured data about skills to produce something like a curriculum, or to better describe a credential or an assessment, to better describe a job, or in our case here, to better describe what someone knows and is able to do in the form of an LER. And then last but not least, translation. We need to make sure that as we're passing data between records and job postings, and we have data or information about what's inside of a curriculum, for example, we're all going to semantically be speaking different languages. There is no one universal language for skills or competencies, at least not in the United States. So what we want to do is to make sure that how I describe what's in a record, how I describe what's in a job, how I describe what's in a curriculum can semantically be different, but I can assess and determine level of fit. So basically this is translation, and how can we use technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning to support the translation of competencies and skills across these different nodes. So I just want to give you some visuals to show you some of the work that's happening to enable this skills data workflow through T3 and through T3 partners. We have developed tools to support the data standards community. So if we need to map and harmonize data standards between education and HR, we are doing that now. And we built a tool to make what is otherwise a very manual and laborious process into a much easier one. So that's where our network said we needed to take action. So we built this tool called the Data Ecosystem Schema Mapper, which would allow you to map any 2 or more data standards together to promote interoperability. We also created the Competency Framework Extraction Module, which allows you to take unstructured data and to produce it in a structured data format, that conversion tool. We built a prototype one, and we continue to test it today. I mentioned authoring as another piece of the skills data workflow. There are multiple partners out there that are creating new authoring tools. For example, IMS Global, which is now called One EdTech, has a authoring tool to produce a competency framework. OSN, the Open Skills Network, has developed a tool called Osmint that will allow you to author a skill collection. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation is involved also in some authoring efforts, and we actually have, I'm going to come back to these a little bit later in the presentation, but we're producing a new one called JobSide, which stands for Job Skills for In-Demand Employment, to better describe jobs. But we also have an effort that's going to be at a utility scale called the Jobs and Employment Data Exchange, or JEDX, but I'll come back to those. You'll recall I mentioned the power of search and how we need to support curation. So we can't just produce the skills, we need to house them somewhere so someone can find them. Well, one of the things we're trying to solve for is not so much how to build a library, but how to search across them. So we are supporting the Open Competency Frameworks Collaborative, the OCFC. It's going to be called the Competency Explorer in the future. But what this is going to be is a global system where anybody could stand up a library of 1 or more frameworks and adopt a protocol that would allow someone, by going to one library, to be able to search all libraries within the network. So this is what we mean about making it easier to search. I now no longer need to go to 5 different libraries to find what I need. By going to one, I can search all of them. And then one of the powerful use examples, of course, is learning and employment records. So what are we going to use this skills data infrastructure for? We want to use it to better describe what someone knows and is able to do and empower them with that data. So we're working with the community to figure out how to support the records themselves, whether they're coming from an employment setting, an education setting, a military setting, or somewhere else, and how we're supporting the digital wallets that will house these records for an individual. One of the early things we did in T3 was support a digital wallet specification because that was identified as a critical missing piece in the LER ecosystem. We've also supported research around how LERs could be built to be more equitable in our society. And we have a number of other projects here, one of which is the single skill endorsement credential, to create a very lightweight standard that anyone can adopt in order to identify or recognize 1 or more skills learned, whether it's on the job or in a classroom. So we're working with the standards community and W3C. And we're also working on that resume profile specification, which I mentioned earlier. I'm going to come back to Experience U in just a second, because that's a very exciting LER project. But I wanted to get to this last piece, which is translation. And this has been kind of the last mile problem, is we can produce these skills, we can put them in the form of a record, but how can I make sure that if I'm trying to compare that record to something like a job, that I can do the translation, the machines can do the translation. So we have recently, as recently as earlier this month on August 4th, we were able, as the T3 Innovation Network, to convene in Washington, D.C., where we brought together leading AI experts to educate us on what's the state of AI, what are the possibilities, what are the challenges, are we there yet? So we are going to be working more in the AI space in order to figure out how we can leverage AI to support these translation services and other important AI services for the talent marketplace. I mentioned Experience U. This is going to be our first attempt at getting in the artificial intelligence space. One of the problems we're trying to solve for is, if we're creating these learning and employment records, we need to issue it's newly issued records or credentials. But if we are going to wait to have a critical mass of these records, it's going to be a long time, because We have a huge population out there, working age population. People are already using resumes. There's already an HR workflow process out there. Unless there's a critical mass of these records, it's not going to disrupt our business processes. So how are we making sure HR is changing, HR vendor tools are changing? It means these records need to be in mass production. But at the rate we're going with just issuing new credentials, it's going to take a long time. So the problem the Chamber Foundation wanted to solve is how do we meet the workforce where it's at today? Let's not ignore all that prior education and employment experience and leave those folks out. How do we bring them in? How do we bring their past forward into the LER ecosystem? So what we're going to test with Experience U is, can we leverage existing AI tools to look at someone's past employment and education experiences and translate that into a standards-based, skill-based LER that they can self-verify. They could always go and have a third party verify aspects of it. Can we at least get them to self-verify, which means it's better than a resume today because it's machine actionable LER data that's been self-verified and hopefully better described because now you have the technology working for you to better describe all the things you know and are able to do, things you may have been leaving out, but now can bring in. So we think this is an exciting effort to test whether AI is there, but to really bring the entire workforce into the LER community. We're going to be kicking off this project this year, and we're going to be doing a demonstration next year. And I wanted to pivot a little bit now to talk about another aspect of this, because if we're producing all of this great learning about skills and learning and individuals, we can't lose sight of the fact that you need structured data about the jobs as well. So not just structured data about the learning and the individual, but structured data about the jobs. It's both and. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation actually has a couple parallel initiatives happening within T3 or happening outside of T3 that are going to be very synergistic with it. And one of it is something called JobSide, which is a new set of tools we're developing that are employer facing, which will help employers better use skills data to develop skill profiles for the most in-demand jobs. And it will support them in doing job analysis. So we'll have an output of a skill profile that's been employer validated. So if you want to know which jobs and which skills are most important to which employers, we seek to build a global repository of these skill profiles that are employer validated and to make them available as structured data that can not only be shared with HR systems, but shared with education partners that want to map their curriculum to it. So we're very excited to bring that innovation forward. And the other one is JEDX, the Jobs and Employment Data Exchange. While we talk a lot about the learning, we can't lose sight of the E in the LER, and that's the employment record. So we have been working now to develop data standards for not only job postings and descriptions, but for employment records. And we're doing it through this effort called JEDX. And what we're seeking to create is a multi-state public-private data trust that would produce structured data at scale about jobs and the workers in those jobs. We think this could fundamentally transform how the private sector shares data with federal and state agencies in ways that reduces burden and cost and improves data quality and value. But it's also going to create an entirely new labor market information system that's going to tell us more about what's happening in our job market and more about employment outcomes that we've ever known before. But the exciting thing is the E in the LER, because this could provide a backbone data infrastructure to provide every American worker or learner with structured data about their employment history. And why was that important? Well, they can use that to determine their eligibility for benefits and entitlements, but they could also use that when applying for a job as a verified employment record, and they could also use it when applying for continuing education so they could be awarded credit for prior learning. I wanted to reiterate some projects to watch out for. We're going to be releasing the master use case for skill-based hiring and advancement, which shows where LERs and some of these other data tools fit into the hiring process. We have this exciting work happening in the LER space around single assertions, a resume profile spec, and Experience U. And we're going to be making improvements to a variety of tools that could be of interest, whether it's the data standards mapping tool, the Competency Explorer search tool, or its coordination with programs like JobSide and JEDX. My ask of you is to join the movement. It's free, it's open, it's a collective action initiative, and we have our T3 Network Hub, which you can visit to learn more. You can also sign up. You could join the network, you could join any one of the 4 data infrastructure networks, and you could join any of their work groups. It's really your choice and where you want to lean into the conversation. And it also has a variety of resources that have been produced by T3 over the years, as well as some of our community partners who like to host resources within that library. Here's my contact information. I hope this was a useful presentation to you all. Really excited about the conference and the various topics that you're taking up. And it's my hope that this presentation around data interoperability can open up a new dialogue between what we're doing at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation and within the T3 Innovation Network and what you all are doing within your IT association in Japan. So we welcome the opportunity to partner, and thank you again for being part of your program today.
ありがとうございました。一件質問をいただいております。アメリカ発の職能規格が普及するのはいいとして、米国企業がグローバル人材競争で優位に立ち、日本や途上国は人材難にあえぐことになるのではというご質問をいただいております。こちらのご質問についてちょっとこの場ですぐお答えできないので、メールでまた、対応させていただきたいと思います。同じくお寄せいただきました質問については、別途、ホームページの方で公開をさせていただきたいと思っております。画面共有の方をお願いいたします。これにて本日のセッションはすべて終了となります。ご質問はこちらに記載のメールアドレスまでお寄せください。イベントレポートにて、ホームページにて来月以降に公開予定ですので、どうぞお楽しみに。最後になりますが、Zoom をご退出いただく際にアンケートのご協力をお願いしておりますので、ぜひご意見をお聞かせください。ちょっと最後になるんですけれども、もし、ご登壇の皆様、それから長谷川人副会長ライブでもご参加いただいております。一旦画面共有の方を外していただきましたらですね、いかがでしょうか。パネリストの皆様、もしお話しいただけるようでしたら、長谷川人副会長からも、一言ご挨拶いただければと思います。
Thank you very much for joining us today. It's very nice lecture. そう、日本語本当に今日はありがとうございました。そして大変長い時間かかりましたけど、皆さん最後までお付き合いくださいまして、大変感謝申し上げます。これを機会にですね、できるだけこのような国際的なセミナーを継続して開催し、そしてその人類全体の、世界全体の ICT の進化をリードしていっていただけたらありがたいなと思っています。皆様本当に今日はどうもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。これにて本日のセミナーを終了させていただきます。ご参加の皆様ありがとうございました。Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
失礼します。
はい、ありがとうございました。事務局の皆さんもどうもご苦労様でした。ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。